All right, good morning. So welcome to this morning's session of Psyfeld. The discussion will focus on the Andrea Doria. Where would you like to start? Pick a character, pick a scene, anywhere.
We can start by talking about Gwen. I thought when she was like going on the date with that guy, and he told her that she had a big head, and then like throughout the rest of the episode, like all these random characters kind of like fed into this vision that her head was too big because people were like running into her. So I thought from like a side perspective, she let this kind of like stranger perception of her, and she started to do that as that is how I actually am.
So a couple of things going on here, and I'm not sure which one actually applies to Elaine in this particular episode, but any of these could be on a shelf exam, so it's probably worth reviewing. All right, so the general process of having someone's perception of you impact your self-image psychologically. What does that refer to? Projective identification. Yep. You looked at it?
No, I didn't. Yeah, it came up in DXC.
Good. Kudos. Yeah. And it's a variant of external locus of control. It's an example of an external locus, and individuals who have an external locus who actually have the way they feel, the way they think, the way they behave, directly influenced by perceptions of others, certainly have a risk for developing a mental disorder. Right now, does it always happen? Of course not, and certainly it doesn't predict a specific type of disorder, but there's a risk. Similarly, people who have an internal locus have a protective factor. A lot of things that are said about them, said to them, don't get the same reaction. And that really is the basis for the SOR theory of psychology, this stimulus organism response, which is kind of an offshoot of the SR theory, which is behaviorism. And people like Albert Ellis, cognitive psychiatry or psychology, developing SOR with a real focus on the organism, the O in that acronym, and specifically the organism's cognitions, how one processes information, and then reacts or has a response. Right? And that process, that cognitive schemata, can have an internal versus an external locus of control. So that's one of the things I think this particular scene identifies.
Yeah.
Now, let's say, hypothetically, that you've watched previous episodes from previous seasons, and in this character, Elaine, there seems to be a pervasive pattern of her doing this, right? So her cognitions might be stable and might be that stable filter that consistently interprets others' actions, beliefs, attitudes as malevolent, as dangerous. Along those lines, what now comes to mind for the clinician? Yeah, that's actually the etiology of paranoid personality disorder, where people misinterpret others' actions, others, all of the above, with motive. Right? That's paranoid personality in itself poses a risk for developing psychotic disorder. All right, what would Freud say in terms of the development of the paranoid personality along these lines? What else might be in play here that we probably should briefly review in prep for your shelf exam? Think ego defense mechanisms. You referred to it before. Yeah.
Projection is a defense
Right.
mechanism, is an initial defense mechanism.
Yeah, and so we'll fold that back in there, right? So it's the reattribution or misattribution of one's own beliefs, impulses onto another, so as to not feel the threat of what you're really thinking, right? So those impulses are housed in the Freudian id, that aspect of our subconscious or unconscious, yearning for conscious expression, but the superego will not allow it because it's too threatening, it's taboo. So this friction causes anxiety, and anxiety is alleviated or kept sub-threshold by the ego through these unconscious processes, i.e. the ego defense mechanisms, projection being one example. And there might be other episodes in which Elaine does project, and if that is the case and it is recurrent and if it's clinically significant, we probably do have to investigate the etiology and therefore the most likely diagnosis. And the paranoid personality disorder probably would be at the top of our differential. What other behaviors did you say? Actually, for completeness sake, what are the other two cluster A personality disorders in addition to paranoid personality? Good, right? The schizoid and the schizotypal personality disorder. I never learned how to pronounce that last word. So as long as it's on a shelf exam and written, it doesn't matter. Right. What's the hallmark quality of the schizoid personality? That was my next question, right? And that differentiates readily from what other personality disorder? Avoidant personality. So individuals with avoidant, again, a little bit of a clue on exams, tend to be self-referred. So the clinical vignette has a self-referral. Now, it may not be for avoidant behavior per se, right? But it might be for depression, anxiety as a result of. So in reading that clinical vignette, if you see the etiology as this need to avoid, not put yourself out there for concerns about embarrassment or some kind of feedback, that's consistent with the avoidant personality, the self-referred. Individuals with the schizoid personality certainly can be self-referred as well, but on shelf exams can often be referred by a third party, right? Because of their social isolation, maybe the Board of Health, something like that. A little bit of a tip in terms of looking at your test question. Good. Other observations about Elaine?
What is the initial response to the guy saying that they had, yeah, came back home and was like, that's it, you know, like, that was nothing, like, that's awesome. Or is a bit of like, you know, professionally, or like, kind of like being the opposite response of how you actually feel. I don't know if I put a projection or if that's
Reaction information, maybe? If she truly felt like that. Yeah, but and again, that part of Elaine's behavior is recurrent. We see her with that type of reaction to different things, especially interpersonal relationships or comments made within interpersonal relationships. Maybe reaction information. Well, and let's go with that just a little bit more. We talked about how these processes, especially if consistent with the paranoid personality disorder, can lend risk for a future psychotic disorder, schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. Brief step back. What are those other psychotic disorders? So the chapter is a schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia spectrum. There's a couple of ways to think about this. Number one is etiology. And it is noteworthy that the schizotypal personality disorder is actually now classified in the psychotic disorders chapter, right? So think about that as spectrum because it does pose risk, and it poses the highest risk among the cluster A personalities. So it is actually published as part of the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders chapter of the DSM. And then the other way to think of schizophrenia spectrum is outside of etiology, is symptomatology, right? So with schizophrenia, you have a timeline and then you have symptoms. The timeline would include other conditions like brief psychotic disorder and schizophreniform disorder. And then from symptomology or symptomatology, schizoaffective disorder, right? So just kind of outlining the chapter in that way. Schizophrenia spectrum includes those disorders that we just mentioned.
Is delusional disorder security?
Exactly right. And that's the second part of the discussion, right? So perfect bridge. Then you have the rest of that title, other psychotic disorders, which includes delusional disorder, catatonia, and then to some respect, shared psychotic disorder, although the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, is phasing that out. Okay. Still appears on test though, so folia do or shared psychosis, otherwise known as shared delusional disorder. So there's three in the quote other psychotic disorders part of the schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders chapter. With this, what if Elaine was diagnosed with a delusional disorder due to everything we just discussed? And now she has a fixed belief that she has a big head. Her head is misshapen. Okay. What subtype of delusional disorder is that?
I'm going to ask if that would be delusional disorder or like probably just more And that's what-
I want that in the differential. Let's talk about that next, especially since we kind of alluded to that yesterday in lecture. What are the subtypes of delusional disorder? Good, erotomania. Next, two. Next, good. Three, two more. Jealous and somatic. So the acronym is JPEGs. Right. Jealous, persecutory, erotomanic, grandiose, somatic. And which type would Elaine be? Somatic, right? There are three variants of somatic, three subtypes, if you will. With dysmorphia being one of them. The other two are halitosis and infestation. Okay, otherwise referred to as delusional parasitosis. God bless you.
So how does that differ then from body dysmorphia?
Okay, that's the next one. Before we get there, because now we have to develop a differential diagnosis. Any questions about the classification of delusional disorder and its subtypes? All right, so how does it differentiate from body dysmorphic disorder, which is now classified as part of an obsessive compulsive and related disorder? So what is body dysmorphic disorder? Did who answered it yesterday? I don't want to pick on anybody though. If the person who answered it yesterday would like to answer it again.
Like it's a preoccupation with a part of your physical appearance.
Right.
Not necessarily not a
And he just gave us our answer. In one condition, the individual is preoccupied, and in the other condition, the individual is delusional, right?
So
So,
they might not be focused on.
well, they're both focused. The question is how much,
Okay.
right? And that's got to be answered, I think, with the word insight. Right? If absent insight, if zero insight, we're going to call it a delusion. If there is some insight, we're going to call it a preoccupation. And a little bit of a simplistic start, but I think that's where we really need to begin. Right now, unfortunately, the APA meeting is a little bit hairy here because there actually is a specifier for the obsessive compulsive and related disorders when it comes to insight. That is, somebody can have body dysmorphic disorder, comma, with no or absent insight. And the question then obviously is, well, why the heck isn't that a delusional disorder? And in clinical practice, that's what we asked him, right? So any thoughts as to what in the world could differentiate body dysmorphic disorder with absent insight versus delusional disorder, somatic subtype? And the answer lies in the process often referred to as stress-induced psychosis. Yeah. So right now, collectively, I had an opportunity to review all of your bios, right? Ready access to medical student records. And not a single one of you has any risk for mental illness. Despite that, we can make you psychotic. Right? There's an element of stress-induced psychosis. Now, given your risk of zero, putting some numbers to this, the level of stress that I would need to induce to result in a breach in reality for each and every one of you would need to be a 10 out of 10. Right? But we can do that. And in 8 hours, one of you, perhaps even one of you sitting at this table, may actually experience some of that. Maybe. On the other hand, if an individual has risk, you could then understand how the level of stress then that would need to be induced a psychotic break would be less than 10, right? So, and with that kind of conceptualization, we could kind of bring it back to the conversation of differentiating between body dysmorphic disorder with absent insight versus delusional disorder. For delusional disorder, the lack of insight is baseline. An individual is delusional. On the other hand, the absent insight specifier is really reserved for that continuum that is induced by stress. So if an individual has body dysmorphic disorder, they are prone, because of their established mental disorder, to stress-induced psychosis. And if there is a clinic day which you are interacting with them and they actually have no insight and are psychotic, it is best to reserve that designation than to now say, I'm going to switch your diagnosis and I think you have delusional disorder. Now, the treatments, the medications that are available to you are going to be the same. Right? However, the treatment plan is going to be different. The overall treatment plan is going to be different. And that's the reason why the APA has that designation. So clinically, I think on the surface, it is a little confusing. But in clinical practice, that designation is really reserved for those episodes of stress-induced psychosis. There's one other point I wanted to make. Generally speaking, when you think of an abnormal thought, so we're talking about the mental status exam and we're talking about the T in the acronym that defines the MSc ABC stamp liquor, right? So the T stands for thought. Thought content. There could be themes, otherwise referred to as killer endings, which also populates the acronym KE, killer endings. Of course, suicidality, homicidality. But then there are other aspects of thought content as well. And that's when you get into these abnormal thoughts beyond SI or HI, starting with the overvalued idea, which is arbitrarily considered to be the mildest deficit in thought content. And by definition, not clinically significant. So many of us, perhaps, especially on Sundays at 1 o'clock at kickoff, may actually engage or demonstrate overvalued ideas. And if you've ever worn a jersey and refused to take it off and sit on the same part of the couch while your team is winning, you have engaged in such activity. Right? So to a large extent, not clinically significant. On the other hand, if there is greater and greater stress, that overvalued idea may actually evolve into something more serious. And ultimately, even a delusion, which would be at the end of that spectrum. So the question is, what are those other terms that connect the overvalued idea to the delusion? The one form of deficit that arbitrarily is agreed upon to be not clinically significant, to the other that is not only clinically significant, but psychotic as well, where reality testing is lost. And those clinical terms that operate the intermediate category include preoccupations, ruminations, and obsessions. Those are the three most common terms, which in clinical practice are largely interchangeable. When you say obsession versus preoccupation, it's, I think, known that your understanding is you're dealing with a clinically significant deficit in thought content, but one that is not psychotic. Right, so intermediate category. Questions?
Just clarifying that word preoccupation. I think I've heard that like internal preoccupations as the term has been used to mean like responding to internal stimuli. Sometimes they're very little bit connected, but just from like what we just talked about, you included obsessions with preoccupation, which feel different.
Yeah, and they are different because that's the different use of the same term.
Okay.
One is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and the other is just used in clinical circles with no real reference that is consistent. Okay, so but you're right. It can be used in certain clinical circles, but when it does, and it seems to connect to psychosis, just know that the term is simply being used differently there. Any other thoughts? Final thoughts about Elaine? There's a lot about Elaine today.
I wanted to ask quickly about internal versus external locus control. If that's something that you generally categorize as like a feature of a person across all domains, or if they can be like domain specific and talking about these things.
Yeah, so the question is whether or not internal versus external locus of control is something that can apply across multiple domains, and the answer is yes. Yeah, yeah, that cuts across. And I think, especially in psychotherapy, of course, but I think in certain aspects is more or critical or important in terms of treatment planning than others. Other characters you want to discuss? The Andrea Doria. Kramer. What's going on with Kramer in this episode?
Maybe with the thing he starts off without having a cough, and he does not want to go to a doctor because he thinks they're like hacks. And so he decides to go to a vet instead. And then he goes to a vet and gets medicine for a dog and then starts acting like a dog, which is interesting. It also has a little bit of the like some action reflected on the person in a way that like wasn't initially intended, like a little bit like a line, but slightly different. But there's a few things that I think that there's like the paranoia against doctors, and then there's like the maybe a logical action that one of the do one or the other, and then of course there's like the ending part where it's acting as if you're the thing that you I don't know how to describe that exactly, but like when you enter the vet, you start acting like the dog.
Yeah, and I think they're connected. So I think to start out, the obvious thing is the subversive comment about the medical or healthcare field. And Kramer being much more comfortable going to a vet, albeit kind of indirectly, than going to a licensed physician, whether it's ENT, whether it's a general practitioner. So I think that's there. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, one of the reasons, there are several reasons, but one of the reasons why an individual might actually have that prohibition is because to see a physician practicing tertiary care medicine in the Western world would be to adopt a sick role. Right? We're having a very difficult time with preventive healthcare, with population health. And the standard, the tradition is you get sick, you see a doctor, you get better. Right? So the idea is, I've got to adopt a sick role to see them, and that puts me in a situation in which submissive, and there's a big problem with that. And he's not wrong. Right? On the other hand, when he goes and sees a vet, he adopts a sick role. That is on steroids. That is much worse than what is traditionally happening in the US. Because by seeing a vet, he actually becomes or behaves like a dog. And is that an over-the-top metaphor for adopting the sick role nonetheless? So it turns out to be almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that the very thing he tries to avoid, he not only becomes, but becomes in just a typical Larry David way, right? That only Larry David can actually express. Yeah. So I do think that's there. Now, to the extent that, these actions are guided by different mental processes, we have to discuss, again, psychotic behavior and whether Kramer has a breach in reality when he does what he's doing, and Jerry just needs to grab a leash and follow him, or gets excited about driving in a car. But that's just a rehashing of what we already discussed. Loose association, pardon the pun, just so that we can actually discuss it in a little bit more detail. If that would be the case, perhaps one of the ways to describe Kramer's behavior would be disorganized behavior. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And because of that, we can look at this as a positive symptom of schizophrenia. Right? What are the other positive symptoms of schizophrenia? Delusions, hallucinations. But they're the big four, right? Due to what neurotransmitter? Dopamine excess or decrease, excess levels, and where? Mesolimbic, I heard it. Mesolimbic. Now, when you lower dopamine at the mesolimbic tract, unfortunately, right now in 2022, we just don't have any modality that lowers it there and nowhere else. So we lower it ubiquitously, including the mesolimbic tract, and we see improvement in what are referred to as these positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Generally speaking, the pathological presence of something that at baseline should not be there. Right? Hallucinations at baseline should not be there. Delusion should not. These are positive symptoms. Lowering the dopamine at other areas of the central nervous system, the brain, including the nigrostriatal tract, results in side effects. Exactly right, aka EPS. Right? Lowering at the mesocortical tract results in side effects, right, including affective changes, difficulty with cognition, side effects of these medications. On the other hand, and worsening of what would be referred to as negative symptoms. Right? So negative symptoms are the pathological absence of something that at baseline should be there. Examples? Good. And others?
Lack of positive speech management.
Good, illusion, good. I see these are 5 A's, right? Go by that second letter of the 5 A's, it spells out the word plant. The only outlier is the A, which obviously is the first letter, for affective flattening. Okay? Otherwise, plant, apathy, alogia, then you get your affective flattening, you use the A. Anhedonia, and attention deficit. Now, the DSM-5 tweaked that a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, for shelf exams, plant. And that is largely due to hypodopaminacity, to a lower level at the mesolimbic tract. So you could get the worsening of negative symptoms by ubiquitously lowering dopamine through antipsychotic therapies. So that's something you have to monitor.
I look at that trade-off in terms of improvement of positive symptoms and worsening of negative symptoms when it comes to how it affects the patient.
On that individual basis, yeah, it's a case-by-case basis. Yeah, that does happen. Mhm. Questions, thoughts about Kramer?
It was funny that he wasn't cool with MPs, but then he was like, I'll go to the vet and take like pills for dogs and almost choked on one.
He justified going to the vet, which I thought was funny. He was like, oh, well, they're back to more experience because they like treat all these different things with them and all sorts of like human doctors, you know, but
Yeah, and
they're inferior compared to that.
there's like logic there, but from missing.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can see it like on its own. It's like, oh, you justified, like to him, that makes sense to us. Like, it's not like, no.
I've never watched Seinfeld before. Is there something in the last 8 seasons where you have a negative experience? Did it talk to you, or-
No, but it's come up, well, you could assume that. I think it's fair. But there are other episodes in which Kramer goes to alternative therapies
Yeah.
and convinces, in the case of the heart attack, another episode, George to seek alternative therapies for an ailment. Yeah, he goes to Tor, healer. It's a great episode. You watch it. So I think it's a fair question. And if it results in clinically significant distress for Kramer, and this episode might attest that it does, something to examine. We're going to leave it there. We're coming to the bottom of the hour. I'm going to take a brief break, everybody together. And then on our second link, come back for table rounds. We'll see everybody back then.